Hey guys, welcome back. If you are new here, hi, my name is Shayna, and in my little corner of the internet, we talk about spooky history of all kinds. If that sounds like something you're interested in, be sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell because I'm here for you on Wednesdays. I also have a podcast called Spooky History with Shayna Blake, and that is where the audio of this video will be. Today's story happened right in my backyard, and believe it or not, I hadn't heard of it until a friend of mine told me about it. So today, we are going to be talking about Cockeyed Billy, the spree killer. William Cook Jr., also known as Billy Cook, was the fifth of 8 children and was born on December 23rd of 1928 in a tumble-down shack near Joplin, Missouri. Him and his family lived in a rundown shack on Oliver Street. His mother died when he was only 5 years old. And they were left with his father, who honestly was a piece of work. His father was a miner who was also an abusive alcoholic. Not long after Billy's mother died, their father would oddly move the family into an old mine shaft where they would live like animals until their father would end up just completely abandoning them altogether. After the children were taken by social services, the social workers were able to find homes for all the children except Billy. Now, Billy had what they called a deformity. He was born with a growth over his right eye, and it would later be removed, but it would cause his right eyelid to always sag, which meant it would never really close all the way. Now, this would lead to merciless teasing, which is believed that the anger we'll see later on is where it stemmed from. Now, people were disgusted by his droopy right eye. Some people were even superstitious and would call it the evil eye. Honestly, I don't think it looks that bad. I mean, I've seen pictures, and if you're watching on YouTube, I'll of course have a picture of him, and you can kind of tell it's really not that bad. But back then, it was a big deal, I guess, if you weren't perfect. So since no one would take Billy in, the courts would eventually agree to pay a woman to take care of him. But the relationship between Billy and his foster mother was severely lacking. This woman didn't really seem to care about anything but the money, which she was receiving for taking care of him. An example of this is 2 years in a row, the foster mother would give Billy a bicycle for Christmas, only to have it repossessed because she wouldn't make the payments for it. Now that might seem like not a big deal, but to him it was. So Billy didn't really have the best upbringing, obviously. He would eventually be placed in boarding school, and it was there in boarding school is when he would start to show signs of violence and psychopathic behavior. He would throw tantrums and make demands and would end up abandoning school altogether at the age of 12. Another foster family would try to take him in, but by this time he was already set in his ways. There was no changing. Now, Billy would begin a life of running the streets and committing petty thefts. Now, all of this would lead him to his first arrest, and he would tell the judge that he would rather be placed in a reformatory than return to his original foster mother. But instead, one of his older sisters would end up taking him in. But soon after this, he would go and rob a Joplin taxi driver, which would put him right back in the reformatory. He was simply described by others as neat, quiet, and with nice handwriting, but could not control his anger. His behavior would just escalate from here. The reformatory would have no choice but to send him to the Missouri State Penitentiary, where he would become a much feared inmate whose conduct was erratic and always violent. One of the inmates would make a sarcastic remark about Billy's deformed eyelid, and Billy got so mad that he took a baseball bat and beat him, almost killing him. So that's terrible. Now, Billy would eventually get out of prison when he was 21, which would end up being a very big mistake. And when he got out of prison, people would describe him as short, heavy-shouldered, brooding youth with a pimply, undershot chin and the legendary hard luck tattooed on his knuckles. And when he got out of prison, he decided to look up his father, which he hadn't seen since he abandoned him at the time. And when he found his father, he was living on a pension in a Joplin shack, and Billy would tell him that he was, and I quote, going to live by the gun and roam, end quote. Now, if that's not a red flag, I don't know what is. I wonder if Billy looked up his father to tell him that as like a slap in the face, like, I'm this way because of you. I hate everyone because of you, so I'm gonna live by the gun and do what I want. That's my opinion. I mean, why else look up his father that obviously didn't care about him just to tell him he was going to live by the gun and roam? So I thought that was kind of weird, strange. Now, Billy would end up traveling out west, and he would find a job washing dishes in Blythe, California, which this job would be the only real job Billy would ever have. But on the night before Christmas, Billy disappeared, leaving his job without giving any notice. Billy would head to El Paso, Texas, where he would go to buy a .32 caliber automatic pistol, and that's when he would start to fulfill his promise to his father. On December 30th of 1950, right outside of Lubbock, Texas, Billy would hitch a ride with a 46-year-old mechanic named Lee Archer. Now, Billy would end up robbing and abducting the man and forcing him into his own trunk. Billy would proceed to drive with Archer in the trunk all the way to Oklahoma City. As they were outside Oklahoma City, Archer had used a crowbar he had in the trunk, which he was able to break the lock and open it up. Archer waited until Billy slowed the car in order to turn, and that's when Archer would jump out of the trunk and roll to the side of the road. Now, Billy would hear the trunk lid banging, and so he saw that it was open and he stopped the car. He grabbed his pistol and pointed it at Archer. Now, Billy yelled at Archer, and I quote, "You better stop, mister. I'm gonna kill you for sure if you keep running," end quote. But Archer didn't stop, and Billy let him run off because he thought to himself that he really needs to save his ammunition. So later, in an interview with Archer, he said, and I quote, "It was either run or be killed by that maniac," end quote. He made a very wise decision, in my opinion. Now, after Archer ran off, Billy got back in his car and drove until it ran out of gas, which happened to be along a lonely stretch of road called Highway 66, which was between Tulsa and Claremore, Oklahoma. Now, Billy would abandon the car and continued along the highway on foot. Then, on Route 66, Billy flagged down a 1949 Chevy sedan. In this car was 33-year-old Carl Moser with his wife Thelma, who was 29, and their 3 kids, Ronald, who was 7, Gary was 5, and Pamela was 3. Now, the family was heading out to start their vacation to the southwest, but right after picking up Billy, he would pull out his .32 caliber pistol and told Carl to drive. They covered 2,500 miles driving through Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. They would end up stopping in Wichita Falls, Texas, and that's where Carl would attempt to free his family. So Carl and Billy would go inside the convenience store, and there Carl would grab Billy and would wrestle with him. But the attendant didn't know what was really going on, and he pointed an old .44 caliber at both the men and ordered them to go outside. Carl would beg with the attendant to help him, shouting, "He's been in my car all day, and he's got a gun and says he'll kill us." But the attendant just shouted back to let him loose. And it was then that Billy broke free and pulled out his gun. And when the attendant saw this, he locked the door of his store, and Billy and the family would drive off. Well, the attendant ultimately felt bad and wanted to try to help. So he ran to his truck and decided to run them down. But when Billy saw that the attendant was gaining on them, Billy started firing shots at him, which prompted the attendant to turn around. Now, after this, Billy demanded Carl to drive to Carlsbad, New Mexico. Now, from there, they drove to El Paso and Houston, Texas, and then Winthrop, Arkansas. But after all that driving, Billy would end up having them drive back to Joplin, Missouri. Now, as you can imagine, the kids and Thelma would really start to get restless. I completely understand. Even having my 2 boys in the car for too long, they just get stir crazy. And put that on top of the stress of a person like Billy threatening to kill everyone if they didn't listen, that's gotta be terrible. So when they were in Joplin, Billy would tell the family that he would leave them unharmed and tie them in a field so that he would have time to get away. Billy then cut strips of cloth from their clothing and bind the parents' hands together and gagged them. He then used a bright yellow cord cut from the children's cowboy hats and bound their wrists. Now, Billy was not a man of his word, however. He did not show any mercy, and he would end up shooting the whole family, even their dog, while they were all in the car, which is so sad to hear. It's tragic. And then Billy would just drive until 3 a.m. with all of them dead in the car. Who does that? He would finally stop in a mine shaft in Chitwood district of Joplin near 3rd and Maiden Lane. Once he disposed of them, he would jump back in the car and headed for Tulsa. In a later interview with the police, he would state, "I arrived in Tulsa as people were going to work. I was excited and didn't want to be seen with all of the blood in the car. I swung off on the side street and headed west on a dirt road. I slid into a muddy ditch and had to leave the car." End quote. Now, it wouldn't be until 2 days later that the car would be found empty, bullet pierced, and drenched in blood. And then that's when a nationwide alarm went out and the police would set up roadblocks across half a dozen states. But by that time, Billy and his gun had hopped a bus and hitchhiked back to Blythe, California. Now, 3 days later, while in Blythe, a deputy named Homer Waldrop would go to someone's home who was known to be one of Billy's friends. And when the deputy went to the door, he knocked and there was nothing but silence. Then suddenly, the door would fly open and a man in a red shirt jumped out with a pistol in his hand. And it was Billy. What luck that was. He took Waldrop's pistol and ammunition belt, then would walk him out to his patrol car, told him to drive south into the desert. And just like that, Waldrop was Billy's next hostage. He would force Waldrop to drive him around aimlessly, just like he did with Carl. During the drive, Billy would brag to the deputy about how he murdered Carl and his family. Sounds like not very smart thing to do. I'm sure he was just trying to intimidate the officer, but still. Why do criminals have to brag before they're caught? You know what I mean? Whatever. After traveling for more than 40 miles, Billy made Waldrop stop the car and forced him to lie on his face down in the ditch. Billy had threatened to shoot Waldrop in the back of his head, but it never happened. Instead, Billy got back into the police car and drove away. Later, Billy would be asked why he didn't kill the deputy. Well, it just so happened that Billy had worked with a lady named Cecilia for a short time while in Blythe, and he said she was nice to me, treated me like a human being, and had been nicer than anyone had ever been to me in my life, end quote. And that woman was Deputy Waldrop's wife. So technically, his wife is what saved his life that day. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, it wouldn't be but 2 hours later that a car passing by would find Waldrop. Then 7 miles down the road, they would find his patrol car with its red light on and the engine running. It turned out that Billy had pulled someone over using Waldrop's patrol car, and that's how he captured his next victim. And that victim was a man named Robert Dewey, who was a traveling salesman from Seattle. Robert would try to grab the gun from Billy, but he would be left wounded in the process. And then Billy would drag Robert into the desert where he would end up murdering him. Now, after killing Robert, Billy took his car to Mexico. Then, in a dreadful repetition, 2 El Centro, California residents were reported missing after leaving for a trip to Mexico. The FBI and police would search effortlessly all the towns and along the border. Immigration and Customs searched every vehicle while using planes and helicopters to sweep the desert roads. Now, those 2 men would be with Billy for the next week, crisscrossing Baja California and Mexico. The captives said they were too afraid to even try to escape because they could never tell when Billy was asleep, because his right eye would always stay open. So I get that. But it would eventually end when Tijuana's chief of police, Francisco Kraus Morales, I'm really sorry if I butchered that, led a posse 450 miles into Baja California in Mexico. There he finally ran the gunmen down and saved the 2 men and captured Bad Man Billy. Coincidentally, on the same day, a Joplin police officer named Walter Gamble discovered the bodies of the Moser family 30 feet down a mine shaft near one of Billy's old haunts. Now, once they were able to get Billy back to the States, a bunch of psychiatrists clustered in Oklahoma City federal court to do a job of hand-candling on Missouri's droop-eyed killer, Billy Cook. But their numbers only clouded the issue at hand, which was for them to determine whether Billy, who had killed 6 people in a cold-blooded murder spree, was sane enough to stand trial for his crimes. So in other words, there were a ton of psychiatrists wanting the job of diagnosing him either sane or insane. 3 of them said he was fit to stand trial, while 4 said he was not. So because of that, federal judge Stephen Chandler would have to decide whether he was sane enough. So the next day, he came to the conclusion that Cook was sane enough to plead guilty, but not sane enough to be given the death sentence. He would end up sentencing the killer to serve 5 consecutive 60-year terms in Alcatraz, which would be a total of 300 years. Alcatraz was a horrible place, so it would be a perfect place for him, in my opinion. Now, I did a whole video on my YouTube channel of the history of Alcatraz, so if you're watching on YouTube or listening in the podcast, I'll have it linked in the description in case you're curious, because it's a pretty interesting place. So, just in case you want to know. Now, there were some people who thought that 300 years was a little too excessive. Now, honestly, we all know he's not going to live that long, right? So as long as he doesn't get out of prison, does it really matter how long his yearly sentence is? It's just my opinion, though. So anyways, because of this, the prosecutor would request for the death penalty. They didn't want to just live his life in prison. They wanted him to be put to death. Now, the Justice Department was apparently dissatisfied with Judge Chandler's decision too, and agreed to surrender the killer to Imperial County, California, where officials felt certain they would send him to the gas chamber for the desert killing of a vacationing Seattle salesman. Now, the U.S. Justice Department, hours after the verdict announced it would honor the request by California to try Billy in Imperial County, it was then on November of 1951 a jury took 50 minutes to find Billy guilty. Billy's reaction was different, to say the least. It said that he smirked his lips and said, and I quote, "I hate everybody's guts and everybody hates mine," end quote. So was that his goal? He hated everybody so much that his goal was to get everybody to hate his? Who knows? It would be on December 11th in 1952 when Billy would have his last meal, which was fried chicken, French fries, peas, and a pumpkin pie. The next morning on December 12th, Billy walked past onlookers and was strapped to the chair in San Quentin's gas chamber. And that's where he would eagerly inhale the cyanide fumes and paid the penalty for his crimes. Now, the warden of San Quentin Prison, Harley Teets, in an interview would state, "He was the most alone man I have ever encountered," end quote. Then Billy's father would go to say in an interview, "You never know where they will end up," end quote. Well, who knows, Senior? If you wouldn't have abandoned him in a mine shaft and actually cared for him, he might have turned out a little different. But who knows? Now, you'd think that would be the end of Billy's story, right? Well, it's not, surprisingly. In Comanche, Oklahoma, the undertaker named Glenn Boydston asked William Cook Sr. if he could claim Billy's body so he could display it in his funeral home. And surprisingly, Sr. agreed to this, which I find very disgusting, but different times back then, I guess. And it is said that at least 15,000 people, including children, would walk past the coffin for one last look at Billy the killer. Now, the Cook family would get upset when they heard that some man was making a profit showing off Billy's body, so they had his body returned home to Joplin, Missouri. Now, the headline of a 1952 Joplin Globe story by a reporter, Gerald Wallace, would state, "Bad man Bill Cook is buried at night in Peace Cemetery." A brief service held at night with aid of flashlights and lanterns before about 15 persons. Funeral consisting of 4 cars and a hearse moves to burial place over back roads. Then the subheadlines read, "Just as the gravesite rites ended, the cry of a small child could be heard in the chill of the night air," end quote. That's actually kind of sad to think about. I kind of feel like Billy didn't really have a chance with the home life he had, with his mom dying and his dad not caring, and then kids and adults alike teasing him constantly about his imperfections. Yes, there's a thing over nature versus nurture. I know there are others who have lived worse lives who chose a different path, but it's still sad to think about, even if he was a horrible person. You know what I mean? Now, he would be buried, like I said earlier, in a cemetery called Peace Church Cemetery, which is known as being super haunted, believe it or not. Many paranormal investigators will report all sorts of spirit activity. They claim to feel uneasy, see shadow creatures, the sensation of being touched, as well as strange lights and full-bodied apparitions. Now, I've driven by this cemetery many times, and it's probably best described as one of the creepiest cemeteries I've ever seen, personally. Someone once told me that they drove by the cemetery and saw a black shadow coming up out of a grave. And well, that's enough for me to say nope. No, thank you. But that is the story of the notorious bad man Billy. Now, he was definitely a terrible human being. Now, let me know what you all thought of this episode. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed it, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and notification bell. Comment what you thought about this story if you have any theories or if there's something you'd like for me to cover next. And if you're listening on my podcast, be sure to head over to my Instagram and let me know what you thought of this story, or if you have any cool stories you'd like for me to cover as well. But that's it for me today, guys. I hope you have a very blessed day. I hope you had a wonderful new year, and I will see you all next week. Bye!